What's up everyone, this is Dariusz Kalbarczyk, co-founder of MG Poland, JS Poland and AngularMaster.dev. Welcome back to Angular Master Podcast. Together with Manfred Steyer, speaker, trainer, consultant, author from AngularArchitects.io, we discuss everything related to our favorite framework. Today we have some special guests from Dynatrace. They are both great software engineers, Cornelia Rauch and Thomas Gsell. Session will begin with Manfred questions. Hello.
Hi. Yeah,
Hello.
I'm really excited that we have Cornelia and Thomas here today with us because we know each other for years, and for some times we worked for the same company. For some time, but not always at the same time. And so it's really a pleasure to interview both of you about how you use NX and monorepos at Dynatrace, because that's also a big topic for us, isn't it? So let's get started with the first question. So perhaps you can tell us a bit what you work on.
Hi, hello. So my name is Connie, and Thomas and I are working for the same company, which was already mentioned, is called Dynatrace. The company was originally founded in Linz, which is in Austria. So we both are from Austria, and the company is offering an all-in-one intelligence solution, which is all around monitoring and kind of doing all the things you usually don't get with traditional monitoring solutions. So like auto deployment of single agent, discovery of entities, up and down the stack, horizontal and vertical and whatever, and root cause analysis and so on, all the fancy things you can do about monitoring. And we in Graz do all the things that are happening around this core product. So we call it business intelligence, meaning we help the company grow and continuously improve customer experience around the product. So what we are currently working on is improving our licensing system and making it easier for the customers to understand their licenses that they're currently having, and also we're adding new features to the licenses that they can figure out what they need in their monitoring or what they don't need in their monitoring or software intelligence solution from Dynatrace.
Awesome. So while I really recognize Dynatrace as one of the major vendors when it comes to this very topic, when it comes to tracing, you find a lot of information on the Dynatrace websites on this. So Thomas, perhaps you want to give us some numbers about the software system you are building.
Yeah, sure. Hi. Regarding the numbers of our monorepository, I want to give you a short imagination of how big it actually is at Dynatrace or in our department. Mainly we started 2 years ago with our monorepository approach, and back then we only had 2 applications in there. But since we are a quite big department and we are teams spread over three countries and have a lot of members in each team, the repository grow really fast. And in the meantime, we have about 20 applications in there. So that means we have backend for front ends and front end applications and services in there, with about 550 libraries that are shared across those 20 applications.
That's quite a number, isn't it?
Yeah, that's quite big, at least for us. I mean, there are for sure bigger repositories out there, but it's quite huge for our situation. And yeah, from the contribution perspective, we have around 30 unique contributors each month who are contributing to the monorepository. And these contributors are, as I said, spread across the world. They're sitting in Detroit, in Gdansk, and in Graz, and they're producing more than 150 commits per per month. And this might not sound too much in comparison with other projects, but we have quite big PRs caused by quite big stories. But yeah, that's a thing we could work on. But yeah, still, we have really a big amount of contribution each month. And if you see it on a perspective of the physical amount of lines we have in the apps and libs folder in our repository, more than 400,000 lines of codes. And these lines of codes are spread across nearly 8,000 files. So yeah, for us, this is already a really big monorepository. And
we recently had an intern doing some statistics for us, so we know the exact numbers all the time.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, so we have some fancy charts about them.
Cool. Intent-driven BI, something like this.
Exactly.
So what does the application landscape look like?
Yeah, from the landscape perspective, let's start at the hosting. We have more or less our own Kubernetes cluster that is hosted in AWS. And we are leveraging some services from AWS, like databases and load balancers and so on. But most of our services are hosted within our own cluster, our own Kubernetes cluster. And within this Kubernetes cluster, we have basically two big types of applications. On one hand, we have the applications for the business logic. They are really responsible for the heavy business logic and are not reachable to the outside world, or they are really encapsulated within this cluster. And on the other hand, we have the applications that are part of our monorepository that provide access to these microservices. We have a microservice architecture within the cluster, and our services within the monorepository provide access to the services within the cluster. So we have, I already mentioned the backend for frontend. We have all the way the backend for frontend pattern, which means for us that we have frontends, or we mainly have frontends, so web applications, where each web application has its own dedicated backend for frontend. And there are not only applications that have a frontend, there are also APIs in there. But at the end, the APIs are nothing else than a BFF for another client that may be a solution at the customer side. And also this solution is considered as a kind of client, like our own UIs. And at the end, this API is then a BFF for this client that is on the customer's, maybe anywhere on the customer's machine. And yeah, these BFFs, so the difference between the BFFs and the services that running within the cluster is basically that the BFFs, as I said, provide the access to the services within. They do abstract or the heavy business logic and API calls to the clients that are accessing all the data, and it's responsible for all the security related stuff like authentication. And also it takes care about the abstracting the heavy logic away, like only providing the data that is really needed. So you can imagine if you need to access 3 or 4 services, you will get much more data back than for the use cases actually needed. And yeah, that's basically how our applications are organized.
Awesome. Sounds very modern. So perhaps a critical question, but why did you choose for a monorepo?
Yeah, that's, let me go back in time a little bit. We started more than 2 years ago. We had several applications across several teams in the same department. And it turned out that we have a lot of code duplications. For example, all the applications were using the same authentication. We had the same authentication server, same authentication strategy. And there were systems in the backend which always needed the same code. So more or less the code was copied over. To get rid of this, we decided as a next step to have our own Artifactory and starting to deploy our libraries so that they can be shared across all the teams. But this comes with other downsides, like from now on, you had to care about versioning. Sometimes you had conflicts with third-party libraries because your app and the library used the same lib and different versions, and so on and so forth. And yeah, you had not really an overview of which application is using which version of which library at the moment, and so on. And it was difficult to update the libraries if you missed some updates in between, and maybe you had multiple breaking changes. And yeah, that was not a really comfortable way to work together. And yeah, the next logical step was to give monorepositories a try. And so we decided from the beginning to try a monorepository with the tooling from Norwell, so NX. And until now, this is the solution for us, because now we don't need to care anymore about the versioning of the libraries. We are always at the latest version with all the third-party libraries we have. We know immediately if the API breaks somewhere. We have a lot of tests in place, so we are quite sure that everything works just fine, even after upgrading a library or extending a library or whatever. And it is not only an advantage from a library sharing perspective, but it's the monorepository was also an advantage for us as developers, because from now on, it was quite easy to switch context between apps, because you knew the patterns, you knew the coding guidelines, you knew the ESLint rules and so on. So it was quite a big advantage for us, and it was easing our life, I would say. But of course, as Spider-Man already told us, with great powers comes also great responsibility. So a monorepository has not only advantages. Yeah.
I can imagine, yeah. And I really feel you, because I also made the experience that dealing with NPM libraries within one project can really be a nightmare. Versioning, version conflicts, distributing, and so on. But as you say, there are not only advantages, I guess there is also a heap of disadvantages.
Yeah,
perhaps
so
Cornelia can tell us a bit about it.
Of course I can. So along the way, from starting with one application, our monorepo, with now multiple applications and so many libraries, which were mentioned before, we were, with this scaling solution, we were facing some problems as well. And one of the biggest advantages that Thomas mentioned is that you can share code with your peers and share libraries. But also there kind of lies also a huge disadvantage there, because of what we were experiencing there, that it leads to blurred boundaries and less sense of ownership. And so in theory, this should lead teams to code reviews, reuse, and less code duplication, and more teams working on the same infrastructure, right? But along the way, this also leads for us to tight coupling to some of the libraries, and sometimes it was not clear to what application a library belongs, and so it was hard sometimes defining boundaries and finding responsibilities to each team, and how to handle this and introduce boundaries. So that was actually one thing we were struggling with. So defining boundaries between the libraries and actually seeing from the structure that we're having in the monorepo which library belongs to. So that was quite hard in the beginning. because we also migrated some applications that were before living in their own repository to our monorepo repository, and they did not kind of fit in the structure that we were having, and this was causing this kind of problems. Which also goes hand in hand with another problem. New developers, which we were onboarding to the repository, had a hard time finding code there and actually finding a common structure that they're used to, because code was all over the place and there was no real way defined where you should place new libraries and what kind of file structure the new libraries should be placed in. So that was one of the big problems. Another big problem, which is quite common, is updating dependencies, of course, that are shared. So this is kind of one thing that needs to be handled on the organizational level, and some communication. I think Thomas can tell you more about this, how we handled that on an organizational level to keep everybody informed if something is changing, and keeping our code healthy, and tell people what other code might be affected by updating those dependencies. And of course, updating dependencies also takes some additional effort to ensure that the code is still healthy, meaning running tests and building the application on every code change. Which brings me to another point which we were struggling with. Once the repository got bigger and bigger, we had a huge issue with build performance, and we were running sometimes regularly into timeouts due to long builds and due to long running tests. And we also had to figure out how to resolve this, because this was really a problem for months until we found like a real solution, because turns out it was not just one problem, it was like multiple problems leading up to this. And last but not least, also refactoring is kind of harder in a monorepo, and creating new libraries within a monorepo works like a charm, but refactoring can be hard, and keeping all files that are connected, like config files, keeping them in sync can be also quite a struggle with those huge repositories that we're dealing with. So I think, those were like the core problems that we were facing there.
I see, cool. So now let's switch to the solutions you found for those problems. You mentioned you have to do something on the organizational level. That means you have to communicate with other people. What did you do for communication issues or against communication issues?
Yeah, well, I think this depends on the team and how you are structured. But in our case, at the beginning of the monorepository, it was quite difficult because more or less everyone did whatever he wants within the monorepository, and we needed to solve this issue somehow. And it was even more complicated for us because we are living in different time zones, and at first we were struggling with that. But in the meantime, we found a mode to work together with each other quite well. And we have basically one simple rule, and that is that we are not, or we should not change anything that affects the developer or the behavior of the monorepo without discussing this change with all the teams. And to discuss these changes, we have mainly two tools. So one is a discussion ticket. A discussion ticket is nothing else for us than a simple Jira ticket. And whenever a discussion ticket is created, every contributor or every developer for the monorepo is automatically pinged. And every developer has the chance to contribute to this discussion ticket. So mainly if you want to change something as a developer, for example, you decide you want to add a new linting rule, or you want to change a new linting rule, you go and create such a discussion ticket. Everyone gets informed about that. And in the discussion ticket, you most probably will describe what you want to change, why you want to change it, and how does it help us. And most of the time you will also at the end for the discussion, at end time for the discussion. Most probably this will be 3-4 days or maybe a week. But at the end of the discussion ticket, everyone had the chance to contribute. And if everyone agrees with the change, there's nothing that will prevent you to actually implement change. And if there are concerns about the change, you, in common sense, you will discuss that with the people that have some concerns about it. And this works really good for us because now you have a quite good documentation for decisions. And on the other hand, we have meetings, bi-weekly meetings that are called monorepository board meetings, where we discuss topics that are not really that relevant for single developers, topics that are more about how to make bigger changes in libraries that are maybe not owned by a specific team. So how to distribute the workload for the teams and so on, such similar topics. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are other meetings, occasionally meetings that occur whenever you want to spread knowledge. For example, if you introduced a new library and you want to let the others know about that, or when the others should switch to the new library. And that's on common sense, some additional meetings.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
And this way to work together works, at least at the meantime, just fine for us. Sure, there are situations where decisions are rushed, but that happens not too often.
Cool. Just to get it right, this is for changes that affect others, like changing the API of a shared library or something like this.
Exactly.
Or introducing a linting rule or multiple linting rules that would also affect everybody.
Okay. But if it just affects me, if it is just about implementing a feature, then I don't have to go through this process.
Exactly, yeah. Then the other things should be defined more or less within the ticket you have to do anyway. So
cool. Sounds great. Yeah, sounds great. So another issue Connie reported before was issues with build times or CI performance in general. How did you deal with this?
Yeah, this was actually a really, really big issue to us. And it also started 2 years ago when we introduced the monorepository, because back then we only had one app within our repository and everything worked smooth and just fine. Because, you can't do many things wrong with just one little application and a handful of libraries. The build pipeline was very fast and it was okay back then. But as I said, we immediately grow from the perspective of developers and also applications in the monorepository. And so we ran very fast into problems in the build pipeline. Let me say it that way, the builds got very slow while we were using a really big amount of hardware resources. So worst case scenario, so to say. And first, some of us thought that it's, we have many apps in there and it's JavaScript, so it need to be slow. And we just aimed for more resources. We got them and the problem was solved for now.
And then it happened again.
Yeah, but surprise, some weeks later, after onboarding some more applications and libraries and writing some more tests, we had the same issues as before. And I'm not really that into deep in our infrastructure, but the first problem we figured out was related to Docker in Docker. So our build pipeline runs basically in a Docker container, and the single build steps are again executed in Docker containers within this Docker container. And the toolings around JavaScript and so on try to figure out how many processes they can do in parallel to make things faster. And when they try to figure that out, they ask the operating system which CPU, for example, is available. And the CPU that was reported was not the CPU that was available in the Docker container, but it was the CPU that was available on the host. And this was a big CPU most of the times. And yeah, then the tooling, for example, the test runner, tried to start. I don't really have numbers, but let's say 10 threads in parallel, but the Docker container was only able to handle maybe 2 in parallel. And so the CPU had more to do with switching context and allocating RAM than it was actually able to perform the tasks it should perform. So the solution, at least for us, maybe there are other solutions, but it worked fine for us, was to leverage the correct parameters for all the tools. So for the test runner, for the linting, for building the applications. And they all had one parameter in common that was responsible for limiting the amount of workers that were started with single processes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that immediately freed up about 50% of our hardware resources, and it also at the same time made our builds very, very much faster, because now the context switching has gone completely. So this watch was a huge improvement for us, but it was not all we have done, because we then figured out that even if NX provides something like a caching mechanism, we did not really leverage it because, as I said, we are using Docker containers, and we leverage every time the build is triggered a new Docker container. So there is no cache anymore. Luckily, there was a solution out there called NX Cloud Cache, or NX Cloud is the name of the product, I guess. But due to our policy in the company, we were not allowed to use that cloud solution because we are not allowed to give data out of the company. So we had luck again, and at exact this time, NX Private Cloud was introduced, and this was basically the same solution, but now in a Docker image, and you were able to host it on your own in your own company. And immediately our builds were much more faster in average again. Of course, there are worst cases where you touch some libraries that affect everything, and then you cannot approach the cache. But yeah, in average, we were about 40% faster overall with builds and tests and things.
Wow!
And yeah,
40%. That's really a cool number.
Yeah, that was really, really a cool achievement for us. And that was not all, because we figured out that we had another problem. Cornelia mentioned it already. It had to do with the how we structured our libraries and how we enforced the boundaries between libraries. We had no rules in place for that, and we needed to refactor basically our whole monorepository, the structure for the libraries and the applications, to have a cleaner, affected tree. So we decided to leverage all the patterns NX suggested, for example, with tagging the libraries, and we also named the directories according to it, and so on. And yeah, at the end, after really much work, we were able to get a really clean affected tree, and already gained another performance advantage because we now needed to build very less code, very less libraries, and test and it.
This was also renamed, and this is also related to that structure and folder structure that we had. For example, I can mention one library that we had that was prefixed with an app. So it was app name /dash types. And this was a library where you thought like, oh, that library belongs to this one app. And if I change it, I will trigger the affected tree for this one application. But it turns out, if you look actually at the dependency tree of this library, it was affecting 6 applications because there were no boundaries enforced and wasn't really, people were just using it and not really looking what they were affecting with this. And every time somebody did a change in this types library, it was immediately affecting like 6 apps and 16 libraries, which is, crazy.
Wow. Coupling by incident or something like this. Someone did an auto import and now it's coupled.
Yeah. So there is a reason why the NX documentation suggests to use boundary enforcement and to use the tagging mechanisms. It makes a lot of sense. I would recommend it to use it as from the very first day.
Cool.
And
as you say, boundary enforcements. Connie, can you tell us a bit about this and about how you manage the issues with code organization?
Yeah, sure. I mentioned this one awesome example that we found, and actually we had a few of those kind of libraries where you just later on figured out that there are much more dependencies and this kind of spaghetti code, which was then affecting everything. And by this point, we already had something like a tagging strategy. So people were actually like using NX already, and we had a tagging strategy. But when you looked closer at this tagging strategy, it didn't really do what we wanted it to do. And for example, we were using some tags, but we were not using all tags that NX was offering us. For example, we were not using the tagging mechanism called scopes and grouping folders. So that's what we're completely missing out. And introducing scopes in the right way helped us tremendously, reducing those like cutting clear boundaries between applications and actually clearing up our folder structure. So as I know, Manfred, you're a big fan of domain-driven design. So we have taken a look at domain-driven design. And of course, everybody knows about domain models and how it's just a simplification. It's an interpretation of reality that abstract aspects for solving a problem. But we were actually looking closer at domain models, and we realized domain models are living in a context. And the context actually is what is really important for domain models, but because depending on which kind of context its domain model is living in, it might mean something completely different. For example, resolutions in a different context can mean something completely different. So in one part, it means like days and minutes, and another part, it means like years, 10 years or something like this. So we were looking at that context, and what we are thinking is that we can take this context as a scope. And the context for us, for everybody, context can mean something different. And the context for us is, for example, an application, a part of your code, or a work of a particular team. So we actually took the part of the context quite loosely. And so we were defining our context like this, and we actually figured out if we take that context and also take it into in account for our folder structure, we're really getting a nice folder structure. So what we did, we split up again in apps and libraries, and then we let the scope also define our folder structure. For example, you could have a library, then you have the scope of the library, then type, and then the library name, and that makes up your path to your library. So for example, you have a library which is called admin application, and this is a front-end library, and it has a dashboard, and it has a feature called adoption. So this would live then this has a scope of admin FE for front end and dashboard, because that's what it's scoped for. And then this would be the path. So it would be lib admin FA dashboard, then feature because it's a feature library, and the adoption because it's the name of the feature library. And so that's what we were playing around with. And so we actually had our scope. So we also had a nice folder structure where Thomas wrote a really, really nice tool to actually check if the folder structure is applied. So actually, if people are placing the libraries according to the scopes. So we actually had a way to enforce people of using those scopes and placing them into the right folders. And for shared libraries, we were a bit more loosely about it, because for shared libraries, the scope is always shared, and we decided for now to not introduce sub-scopes for shared, because it just made it really messy. If you have the need, of course, you can introduce sub-scopes there as well, but for now, it worked really, really fine for us. And so shared libraries are more a bit looser than other libraries defined. So and now it's also easier to find your way in the monorepo because you actually know what you are affecting if you're touching a library, because you already see what kind of scope you're affecting.
Cool. I really love this domain thinking, contexty, a clean structure for your folders. I really love this. Cool. So Connie mentioned that there is a tool that keeps everything in sync. And this tool was written by Thomas. Thomas, can you tell us a bit about this and perhaps other tools?
Yeah, sure. Basically, when we started with the whole refactoring, we figured out that there is often the issue that the path was wrongly named, or a tag was missing, or even if you work with monorepositories, you need a lot of boilerplate code. For example, you need to register libraries in an NX.json file, in the workspace JSON file, in the chest config, and so on and so forth. And basically, there are tools, there are schematics provided by an X or Angular or whatever, but you cannot guarantee that everyone is using those tools. And so we had sometimes the issue that, for example, the registration of a library was missing in the NX.json file, or there was a wrongly named folder for one library, or wrongly placed library in the folder structure. And what happened then is that it was not very easy to find out where the issue was, because NX did not, at least back then, did not give you a clear error message what's wrong. So you had to find out where is a special configuration missing, or is there a configuration missing. And then we decided that it would make sense to create a tool that basically checks the integrity of the whole workspace. And at the end, it was a command line tool written in TypeScript, which checks for several things, like it will open all the JSON configuration file, pass the content, and it will check if every single library and application is also properly configured in the other JSON files. It will check if the directory structure is consistent to the apps and to the text that were used. And it will also check, for example, if there is a boundary enforcement rule configured for every tag that is available, and vice versa. So it will do the basic checks for the monorepo, for the configuration within the monorepository that is needed to allow it to properly build, test, and lint. Otherwise, if we don't have these checks in place, you will recognize very late. Maybe the linting will work, but the build will fail because of configuration issue. And this tool will help you a lot with that. And finally, we integrated it into our Git hooks and also into our build pipeline. So whenever you are going to make a commit, or even if you make a commit with --no verify, at least the build pipeline will recognize problems with the configuration very early and won't waste your time or resources. So that's about that one.
Yeah, sounds good. That's also something I always like to mention, and it really fits to everything you've told me, you need a process and also tooling when you want to go with a monorepo. Without both of them, you will very likely not be successful. Cool.
We actually also wrote some schematics as well that checks to help you creating those libraries with the right structure.
Nice. Cool. So let's assume you want to help someone who is starting with a monorepo. What would you recommend then?
If you have an organization quite monorepo, or at least a repo that has multiple applications in there, you always have to keep in mind that you need some resources for housekeeping and maintenance and for additional work like tooling or creating the right linting rules, continuous integration and continuous deployment as well. That a lot of resources and a lot of time and effort goes in that as well. And it's not just getting advantages, also like figuring out how to deal with the disadvantages that come along with monorepo. And I think the bigger your monorepo gets, the more you're feeling these disadvantages. We are quite mid-size, I would say. We're not really, really big monorepo, but I think along the way, the bigger you get, the more struggles you can have with this monorepo approach.
Wow, yeah, good advice. So thanks for this. Thanks in general for all those things you two told us. I think this is very valuable, this case study we've got from you today. We always say, to add something to this, that community is, however, not only about techniques or technology, it's also about other topics. And that's why Darek prepared some further questions for you.
Yeah, thank you so much for all these great answers. And I have a few more non-technical questions. First question is, how the pandemic affect your work? Who is first? Cornelia?
So yeah, for me in the beginning, it was really hard. Because I started out working in this company just in October. So I was introduced to a complete new team, and I didn't really have a good way to connect all of them. I still have one team member I never met. So I never saw him physically.
Perhaps he doesn't even exist.
Yeah, and maybe he's just a bot, so I don't know.
Yeah.
So sometimes it is really hard, and also we are heavily depending on Scrum, and having all these Scrum meetings remotely is, I think, much more more exhausting than it would be if they were in person. So yeah, this is kind of a struggle. But otherwise, sometimes I also feel I'm more productive when I'm working from home, because you don't have all this distraction you would have in the company. So it's, there are two sides to this whole pandemic thing.
So in summary, you prefer work remotely or stationary?
I like both. I would really like to see that Dynatrace goes forward with a policy that allows both working from home and also working in the company, because I think both both kind of ways are valuable and have their down and upsides.
Okay.
It's a good mixture, I would say.
Thomas, how about you?
Yeah, I had a bit more luck than Cornelia because I applied at Dynatrace before the pandemic, and I was there for about 4 months until the first lockdown. So I had the chance to get to know the people in person, and in my opinion, this helped me a lot, especially when you are new in a company. It's good to get to know all the people you're working with. And yeah, once we were in the lockdown, I guess this heavily depends on the team, the people, and the size of the team. But the team I'm working in is quite small, I would say. We are about 6 developers, 1 team captain, and so on. And it worked out quite good for us at home. And at Dynatrace, you need to know that you are often in contact with people from other offices like Gdansk or Detroit. And so it has not changed that much, because if you do a Zoom meeting in the office, or if you do a Zoom meeting in the home office, it's not that big difference. So we were already used to Zoom meetings, to have a lot of Zoom meetings. And but yeah, if I could decide, I would say in the meantime, I would prefer a mix of both, because I really like to have the flexibility at home, at the home office, especially if you have a family. But I also really appreciate it when I can talk to people, to get together with a coffee and talk about several things which you would most likely not talk about if you're at home, or at least you won't make a meeting for everything and do a Zoom meeting for that. And like Connie said, I also think I'm a little bit more productive at home. At first, I had a little bit of fear, or I felt a bit guilty, because I always thought that if you are at home, everyone thinks that you are doing nothing. But at the end, it turned out that you are doing a lot more of work than actually when you are in the company.
Yeah, exactly. I feel the same. So if 100%...
The only thing that's really missing is the Flurfunk, as we call it. So the gossip is missing at home.
Okay.
Yeah, totally.
So this is the next question. If 100% remote work possible in a long run, what would you miss the most?
Gossip and coffee with colleagues, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the same for me.
Yeah.
Also, there are a lot of information that you get when you're drinking coffee with colleagues that we would otherwise not get, which are also important to work. So it's not just gossip. So it's just also this.
Yeah, it's not that easy to spy other chats.
Yeah, exactly. We always should see our work, our life holistic. So it's not only work. It's also colleagues, it's also the chat, it's also gossip, it's a lot of things going on. And if we sit at home, we are alone. Of course, we are productive, but we are alone. Yeah, so both is good and both have some disadvantages. Also for me, yeah, but I totally agree with you. So the last question is, what one thing that our listeners should remember from this podcast? It's a hard question, I know it. Who will start?
It's a really difficult question, but in general, I think have fun with your solution and what you're doing. I think that's the most important thing. It's really, if it's just a pain and you don't like working with the kind of solution you're having, isn't probably wrong for you. So I think like having fun at home or at work or with your code base, it's the most important thing.
Yeah, Thomas, you want to say something more?
Regarding to monorepositories and then X, I would strongly advise to follow or to read the documentation exactly, because a lot of pain we felt was because of not following strictly the suggestions or adopting it probably to our solutions. And like Connie said, it's every time important to have fun with your solution. So you should be satisfied and you should have fun working on it. You should like working with it. And then nothing can go wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you so much for joining today's podcast. It was a pleasure to host you. Thank you, Cornelia.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Manfred, for hosting today.
All. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much and see you around.